So, dear guests, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we're now coming to the end of a very intense and instructive day of conference. We've heard a lot of very stimulating presentation, including, of course, the keynote speech given by the President of the European Court of Justice. As a representative of one of the partners within the LAwTTIP network, it is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome our last but not least speaker, Baroness Falkner of Margravine. Baroness Falkner is currently chairman of the EU Financial Affairs Subcommittee in the House of Lords. She was Chancellor of the University of Northampton and is visiting professor at King's College. No doubt that dialogue between academics and practitioners, including, of course, politicians, means a lot to her and is highly appreciated by my colleagues here at the King's. So, Baroness, it is a great pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you very much for having accepted the invitation of my colleagues Andrea Biondi and of all the European Center of European Law. Sorry, I wasn't correct. Yeah, we're very much looking forward to hearing your concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Biondi. I'm delighted to be here on this opening day of what I hope has been a really fruitful conference for you today, and I note you continue tomorrow. But I need to add the caveat that I'm neither a trade expert nor a lawyer. But you'll also be relieved to hear that I won't be making any reference at all to Brexit in my remarks. The issue has become a national embarrassment, and I will leave it at that. My choice of subject for this talk is about the danger posed by the lack of democratic accountability in EU policymaking, in the law and rule-based nature of the EU itself, and my argument is that this goes a long way in explaining discontent with Brussels and the EU across several member states. As a liberal and as an enthusiastic proponent of the EU, nearly 30 years ago, I was fascinated by the negotiations on the Maastricht Treaty. The implications of a huge shift of sovereignty from member states to EU institutions were the way we saw it here in the UK. I worked as a researcher in Parliament during that period and witnessed heated debates about democratic accountability and the pooling of yet more sovereignty. I then went on to do an MA in European Studies, writing my thesis on British attitudes towards European integration. Well, we had an answer to that in 2016. Let me now look to the future and the new period for the EU without the UK in it. A new Parliament, a new Commission, and a demos where the writ of the traditional centre-right and centre-left parties will probably no longer run. Much will be new, but these events do not really mark a substantial change in the overall direction of travel. Institutions and institutional power remains untrammelled. And it usually grows with every new iteration in the life of a parliament. This is not so much due to a grand design driven by technocrats, but rather it's based on a belief that EU integration is like riding a bicycle. If you stop pedaling, you fall off. So the relentless logic of the bicycle theory of integration is that it can't be reversed or even paused, and the use of law and rules have to be the sole basis of consent and contestation between the members of the group. While I'm the greatest proponent of the rule of law, for the rule of law to work, its bedfellow has to be a democratically accountable constitutional framework. Both democracy and law are interdependent and become hollowed out when one is out of balance with the other. The increasing imbalance between these levers of governance is what concerns me when I think about the future of the EU. To expound on these ideas, I'm going to move away from the topic of this conference and use an interdisciplinary approach, bringing in economics, trade, and politics too. The EU is a classic example of collective action theory, where individual member states come together to achieve what they believe are optimal results for them all. The common assumption is that all members of a group agree on some common interest. Then there is an interest on the part of all of them to further that particular cause. But what if the assumption is erroneous? What if the group is asymmetrical in power? What if the interests of different actors are not aligned due to uneven socioeconomic development, culture, or simply history and geography? In economics, if collective goods are provided by even a small number of members of a group, all will benefit from that. That's the free rider problem. The cost of the greater contribution that some members make for the greater benefit of the whole might deliver benefits to them all, but it may also prove to be suboptimal for the particular actor that's making that large contribution. On the whole, the provider of a common good is unlikely to benefit as much as they might if the benefits of providing that good reverted to them alone rather than to be spread out across the group. The suboptimality of the return may reduce the incentive for that actor to continue. So let's apply this to the EU. In the past, EU integration worked as the bargain struck between the original 6 was that even if the high cost to 1 or 2 members resulted in free riding by the other members, that was a price worth paying. In the small group, there were also trade-offs, and selective incentives were used to soften the cost. So the French were given the CAP, or the institutions went to Belgium to keep them bound in, and the general view was that the gains, not least peace and security, were sufficiently great to tie in Germany. So some sacrifice for the common cause was worth it for all 6 members. But size matters due to the cost of collective action arising as the group enlarges and becomes more asymmetrical. The key element of the logic of collective action then comes into play, which is that the larger the group, the further it will fall short of providing an optimal amount of that collective good. Where larger groups are successful, this is due either to coercion or to the selective incentives that they provide. But optimal incentives, which suit the ask of each and every member of the group, become impossible to deliver as group size increases. Then there's a further variable, the political culture of EU leadership. Leaders and technocrats' attitude to integration is based on a rather deep-rooted optimism. So the tried and tested method is frequently referred to as the Monnet strategy of presenting decision makers with a fait accompli. Or, in plain English, never letting a good crisis go to waste. It suggests that decision makers prioritize goodwill and bargaining power on agreeing the decision itself, rather than testing the implications of the decision across the whole of the group, and most importantly, testing it at national level. The asymmetrical exercise of power and the decision outcome of itself become the ultimate goal. Take the origins of economic and monetary union. Maastricht was difficult to negotiate, so the finer points of where national versus EU powers would lie, and the significant details of the functions of the new institutions which were being created, or their failure, wasn't addressed. Indeed, the possibility of members having to suspend membership of the single currency, or at least being able to impose capital controls, wasn't dreamt of. Recall that I mentioned optimism as the basis of the decision-making. When the financial crisis of 2009-10 created the need to break the sovereign bank doom loop, or to provide large fiscal transfers between the North and the South, the reaction was to refocus on more integration. So the inflexibility of economic and monetary union's straitjacket went unaddressed, or rather was addressed by transferring more power to institutions such as the ECB, ESMA, the EBA, rather than addressing the role of national political and monetary authorities in providing stabilizers and controls. This technocratic reaction to problem solving is no longer capable of delivering accountability and legitimacy. So at least not capable sufficient to retain the trust of the European demos. The demise of the parties of the centre-left and centre-right are not a temporary phenomenon caused by exogenous factors like the internet, social media, or populism driven by unscrupulous politicians, although there are a surfeit of those. Rather, the democratic deficit has been deepening in direct correlation with the increase of technocratic governance, which itself has been driven by the need to tame the forces of globalization. The Princeton professor Danny Roderick first wrote about this danger in his book, The Globalization Paradox, after the financial crash. Roderick identified what he describes as the trilemma posed by hyperglobalization. Countries can't have national sovereignty, hyperglobalization, and democracy all at the same time. They can only ever choose two out of the threes. If you want your sovereignty, you have to choose between democracy or globalization. If you choose democracy and sovereignty, you have to give up globalization. Some would argue that's the choice that Britain is making in undergoing economic damage in this exercise. Likewise, you can have democracy and globalization, but you can't have sovereignty, because the cost of integration into global markets is global regulation. Roderick has developed this further, showing that transnational markets create a host of exciting possibilities for trade, but they can also undermine accepted democratic norms, regulations, and institutional practices. He sets out two examples of federal union and regional integration to illustrate his globalization trilemma. The two examples, unsurprisingly, are the European Union and the United States. The European Union is essentially a globalization experiment on a regional scale. Its incomplete integration has become painfully apparent since the euro crisis. The European Central Bank is the lender of last resort, which necessitates some form of banking union. If banking union is needed, then so is fiscal union. And fiscal union can't work without political union, which of itself requires democracy, which means, you guessed it, giving up sovereignty. So you can have at best two, but not all three, the trilemma. By contrast, the US has a fully functioning currency union because all banking and cross-border trade are regulated by the federal government. And the demos of each state have representation both locally, but importantly, as part of the whole in Washington, D.C. This representation is meaningful in terms of the size of constituencies, the common identity, culture, values, and backgrounds of the representatives. Added to that, there is the further safety valve in the form of bicameral legislative arrangement, Congress and the Senate. Now, none of these things exist in the Eurozone, and that's why citizens feel they don't have a voice in the hugely important economic and political decisions being made about their lives day in and day out. But one can be pessimistic about the future of the EU. True federal unions take a long time to construct, and the EU doesn't seem to have either time or a stable, cohesive political environment for this to work through. In the end, immigration, economics, uneven development may become so powerful as disruptors of the project that some European countries may opt for democracy and national sovereignty over more and more cross-border integration. But if one was an optimist, and I am, and believes in the EU, then the question arises of what is to be done. We've progressed too far to undo the project, but there is an acute need to reassess how we proceed further. EU technocrats, I would argue, need to have self-restraint in the exercise of their powers. First, to respect the constraints on their powers as currently exist, and then to go beyond that to consider more co-decision between themselves and national technocrats or governments. This might need to be formal and institutionalized, with greater teeth than the yellow and red card systems their national parliaments have at the moment, where the thresholds are too high and the system is too time constrained. So the next treaty change should move in the other direction, to deharmonize and renationalize some powers. A good example of where one might go is the joint German-Belgian initiative yesterday to abandon the use of Article 7 against Poland and Hungary and to establish a committee which should have come into work, had it existed, upstream to work with the governments of those two countries, elected governments, I might remind people, to resolve the rule of law breaches before they reach this confrontational standoff. The court, CJEU, also suffers from a legitimacy gap. The law it enforces is increasingly created under qualified majority voting rather than unanimity. Lisbon really accelerated that, as you will know. So there is often no underlying democratic mandate behind a decision taken if you're a country that got outvoted in the making of that decision. The judgments of the court don't allow for dissenting opinion, and they have far-reaching consequences, yet those consequences often go unnoticed. The countries which are not parties to the case often don't recognize that a seemingly irrelevant decision taken against another state may end up with political consequences further down the road in their own national, domestic context. While at national level, an inconvenient judgment may be repealed by the executive acting through the legislator, at EU level, where a single decision lays the ground for a whole line of jurisprudence, this only comes to light further down the road and retrospectively when nothing can be done. So how can one recast the CJEU to allow for member states' interests and powers to be upheld? One method would be to insert an override clause in the treaties, which allows the European Parliament, the European Council, or a collection of member states to disregard court decisions in certain kinds of cases. I know I'm saying something rather controversial. I say that with trepidation, but what's the point of being here if we can't have a conversation? Another method would be to separate the constitutional functions of the court, which challenge the sort of day-to-day functions, which challenge member states' the constitutional functions, which challenge member states' competencies and ultra vires acts, from the day-to-day contractual sort of adjudication of lower levels of EU law. So the higher level law would be unchallengeable, perhaps even in a separate court entirely, but the lower levels would be repealable through some formula of member states, the European Parliament, and other institutions. These are thoughts that are well traversed, and I have to say that I'm not an original thinker in this regard. I have read Damien Chalmers' excellent edited book on the end of the technocrat's dream, where they go into the detail of democratic accountability across the range of areas of EU competence. But let me conclude by being the first to admit that there aren't any easy answers to the problem of the legitimacy gap in EU powers. But the new Parliament and the new Commission may get a fresh opportunity to rethink how it can best serve the citizens of the EU, where it itself becomes an area of lower contentiousness. I think one of the things that we will see as we move beyond the European elections is that the result of the elections will be a more fractious, a more divided European space than we currently find, despite the travails of this country. I sincerely hope that the EU will be able to resolve these problems. I hope from the bottom of my heart it does, because the belief of EU citizens in this project is profoundly important. So I wish you all very good luck in doing that. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that was really a fitting conclusion with a little bit of interesting proposition, which I'm sure that we can keep on discussing a little bit further on. But seriously, we're extremely grateful for your time and for concluding what is actually our first day. So now my duty is just to simply, first of all, to remind you that For the aficionados of international trade, tomorrow we're going to be in a different building, so don't come here. We're just on the opposite at the law school. It reminds me to invite you for some tariff-free wines. Enjoy before it lasts. But finally, I would like once again to thank Baroness Falkner for her concluding remarks. Thank you so much.